A new United States man of war makes a trial run before joining the fleet. 41,000 tons of fighting ship, she's the fastest, most powerful battleship afloat.
There are few spectacles as impressive as a battleship undergoing trials for the first time. The United States Navy was certainly no stranger to this, having completed no less than 10 modern battleships in the years before and during the Second World War. These 10 dreadnoughts were spread out over three separate classes. Though the classes differed in various ways, they all shared a common design feature in the form of skegs. Skegs have long been a feature of ship design, and just as ships have evolved over the years, so too have skegs. So what are skegs? By definition, skegs are a projection of the stern section of a ship's keel. Traditionally, they were located on the center line of the hull, and it was in this position that they were often used to support the weight of a rudder, an example of which can be seen here on this New York-class battleship. For warships with centrally mounted screws, the skeg could also be used to fully enclose the shaft, an example of which can be seen here on a Bismarck-class battleship. And in yet another example, skegs can also be used in a position where they support neither the shaft nor the rudders, such an example of which can be seen here on the German aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin. Now, as time went on, skegs started to go through an evolution of their own. They started to move away from the center line in some applications, and this was especially true for the final generation of American dreadnoughts. So what do skegs do exactly? This is a question that's likely best explained through example. Since the United States Navy took skegs further than any other navy, we will focus on their battleships. This is convenient as most of their battleship classes adopted skegs for different reasons specific to that class. We'll start with the first of America's modern dreadnought, the North Carolina class. Designed during the 1930s, the North Carolina class had long and protracted development. As the first modern battleships of the United States Navy, the North Carolina class incorporated new technologies and features. Of course, this included skegs. The inclusion of skegs in the North Carolina class came about due to several reasons. First and foremost, the primary reason was the quest for better hydrodynamic efficiency. Forced to abide by treaty limitations, the United States Navy had to get creative in figuring out ways to better coax performance out of the ship's hull. It was hoped that skegs would reduce drag and improve the flow of water to the ship's screws. This would increase efficiency and in turn lead to greater speed and range. Here you can see some of the models used to test the hull and skeg variations considered for the North Carolina class. The lines marked on the model show the expected paths water would take as it flowed along the hull. Outside of efficiency reasons, skegs were also found to provide several other benefits. They helped to increase the structural strength of the stern, and this was beneficial as the stern of a battleship had been one of its weakest points throughout its history. Due to their location in the hull, skegs also provided a convenient place to continue the torpedo bulkheads further back. This helped to enhance torpedo protection, especially around the rear 16-inch turret. On the subject of underwater protection, it's important to point out that skegs were not intended to protect against torpedoes themselves. More accurately, they enhanced elements of the hull itself, making it more resilient against damage. And this was achieved through better structural integrity and the continuation of those torpedo bulkheads. And now for the most important question: did skegs benefit the North Carolina class? Skegs did increase the structural strength of the aft section of the hull, and they also did reinforce the strength of the torpedo defense system. However, skegs also introduced some issues. Most notably, they contributed to the notorious vibration issues that plagued the North Carolina class in service. Of course, these vibration issues can partially be explained due to the fact that the United States Navy had never used skegs in a large capital ship before. Teething troubles can certainly be expected, and the models they used couldn't accurately show how water interacted with the hull on a full-sized application. Despite the initial vibration issues, skegs continued to be used past the North Carolina class. No doubt the United States Navy had seen some merit to the designs. Designed in 1937, the South Dakota class was to be the second of the United States Navy's modern battleships. Though the North Carolina class were considered successful designs, there were still several issues that the South Dakota class were intended to rectify. One of the biggest issues with the North Carolina class was that its armor was unable to effectively withstand the power of its own 16-inch guns. For the South Dakota class battleships to accomplish this feat would require a great deal of additional armor. However, the battleship still had to abide by the treaty limitations of 35,000 tons. Unfortunately, designers were quick to discover that it was almost impossible to up-armor a hull the size of the North Carolina classes without quickly taking the ship over treaty limits. The only way to gain the necessary level of armor protection, while still remaining within treaty limitations, was to adopt a shorter hull. A shorter hull required less armor, and the weight saved here could then be reinvested into strengthening the armor that was still there. The North Carolina class had a waterline length of just over 713 feet. The South Dakota class, in comparison, utilized a hull with a waterline length of 666 feet. This shorter hull allowed for significant weight savings and allowed the South Dakota class to carry the necessary armor to resist its own 16-inch guns. However, this shorter hull introduced some new issues that had to be addressed. The primary issue here was that the shorter hull did not help with hydrodynamic efficiency. Ideally, a hull will gradually taper towards the stern. This gradual reduction in cross-section permits water to easily flow around the hull. On the other hand, the magazines and power plant required as much volume around them as possible. When looking at the South Dakota class from above, it's clear that space is at a premium. There is not much space to carry the power plant and magazines, while still having enough length to permit a finer hull shape. Luckily, Skegs were here to provide a solution to the problem. The South Dakota class utilized the most radical skeg design among all of the United States battleships. Unlike the smaller, simpler skegs mounted on the inboard shafts of the North Carolina class, the South Dakotas utilized a very large skeg mounted on the outboard shafts. The skegs allowed the hull to retain a cross-section wide enough to adequately house the aft 16-inch turret. However, the wide spacing of the skegs permitted the hull to raise sharply between them. In effect, the skegs granted sufficient width while still allowing the cross-section of the hull to reduce adequately for hydrodynamic efficiency. The highly specialized skegs of the South Dakota class were solely designed to address disadvantages of using such a short hull. Though they performed extremely well, their design was never again replicated on a U.S. battleship. This is thanks to an easing of treaty restrictions which allowed for more tonnage, which in turn allowed for more efficient hull designs. Before moving on, it's worth noting that despite appearances, the skegs of the South Dakota class were not intended for torpedo protection. Though it has been theorized that they would have enhanced protection against underwater detonations, this was not a design consideration, and any benefit achieved here would have been purely unintended. Starting in 1938, the United States Navy began preliminary designs of a new battleship that would take advantage of the escalator clause. This would allow for a battleship of 45,000 tons. The United States Navy desired a faster ship, having become aware of the fact the Japanese capital ships could easily outrun the older dreadnoughts in the American battle line. After several more radical designs, the United States decided to use the South Dakota class as a starting point, investing the additional 10,000 tons into increasing speed, while also adding other improvements. This design would become the Iowa class, the last battleships ever completed by the United States Navy. The Iowa class would inherit many design features from the South Dakota class, including the overall armor scheme and the general layout of the battleship. However, as we had mentioned previously, the skeg design of the South Dakota class was not carried over into the Iowa class. Instead, the Iowas would utilize the simpler inboard skeg-mounted layout of the earlier North Carolina class. This was not due to any issues with the skegs of the South Dakota class. The longer hull of the Iowa class just allowed them to use a more efficient layout. For a battleship that was designed with a heavy emphasis on speed, the hydrodynamic aspect of skegs was a major benefit to the Dreadnought. Even with the Iowa's high length-to-beam ratio and power plant, it was hoped that skegs would squeeze a little bit of additional performance out of the battleship. An interesting fact is that the skegs, though designed for speed, did help in achieving the exact opposite on the Iowa class. They formed a tunnel under the hull that water flowed through. The Iowa class could turn the rudders inwards, closing this tunnel off. This would act as a giant brake and bring the battleship to a quick stop. An effective method, though one that was not used often due to the immense force that it placed on the rudders. We had already mentioned the increase in structural strength that skegs provided on the North Carolina class. The skegs did the same for the Iowa class as well. However, we did not mention that they also helped when dry docking the Dreadnoughts. The skegs could support the weight of the hull and provided additional space where keel blocks could be set up. This made dry docking the ships inherently easier and safer. The Iowa class, though not the last battleships designed by the United States Navy, were the last to be completed. This also made them one of the last capital ships to carry multiple skegs. The last of America's modern battleships, the Montana class, began development in 1939. At first, they were held to treaty restrictions of 45,000 tons, but eventually grew to giant dreadnoughts of over 60,000 tons as treaty limits broke down. In many ways, the Montana class would have been the culmination of America's final generation of battleships, incorporating design features first used on the North Carolina class. Of course, Skegs were just one of these many features that were carried over onto the Montana class. By the time the Montana class began development, the United States had a better understanding of how Skegs affected the hull and its performance. They had found that Skegs, originally intended to increase speed, actually cost speed due to the increased drag. Despite this, Skegs were still incorporated, as the cost was slight and other benefits were still highly desirable. The Skegs of the Montana class were of the same basic style as that used on the Iowa and North Carolina classes. The rationale is the same as on the older battleships, so we won't waste time rehashing the same things we already covered. Sadly, we won't know how Skegs would have ultimately affected the Montana class, as the battleships were never built. Still, with all the experience the United States acquired about their use and design, they likely would have played a large part in producing the strongest and best protected battleship ever designed by the United States Navy. So now that we've looked at the development of Skegs among the U.S. Navy's modern battleships, let's recap real quick. Though chosen for reasons specific to each battleship design, Skegs could provide the following. Structural support. Skegs could help provide an additional level of structural strength to the battleship's stern, one of its weakest positions on the entire hull. Hydrodynamics. Skegs could improve or even change the way that water flowed along the hull. As we saw in the South Dakota class, Skegs could be used to change the hull shape or even its characteristics. Increased support for the shafts. Though we didn't cover this on the U.S. Dreadnoughts, Skegs did provide excellent support to the ship's propeller shafts. A damaged shaft, if not stopped in time, could cause severe damage. This occurred on HMS Prince of Wales during her loss in the Pacific. Enhanced torpedo protection. Though the United States intended that the enhanced protection would come from improved structural strength, the Skegs themselves could act as somewhat of a buffer against underwater detonations. That about wraps up our look at Skegs. This was my first attempt at making a video, so I still have a ton more to learn. Hopefully you still enjoyed it regardless, and we'll come back to see an even better second go-round. In the meantime, hit the like button and subscribe for future videos. If you want to check us out on some forms of media that we are considerably better at this time, check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using the links in the description below.